Delighted to welcome Nicholas Lynch here today to deliver the webinar for us. Nick's an experienced compliance policy and training professional, focusing on leadership, cultural change, and most importantly, because of the industry that he's been working in, conduct risk. He has a strong track record of designing and delivering learning and change projects in operational risk and compliance management. So thanks again, Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Kate, for that introduction. And I should say, yeah, you're right. I've been doing a lot of work in the banking industry, so I'm really pleased that we're talking about ethics, authenticity, and ethics today, because I think that's a real key, issue for the banking industry. Just a few words of introduction. The Institute of Leadership and Management identifies 5 separate dimensions of great leadership: ownership, achievement, collaboration, vision, and with authenticity at its heart. Each of these 49 webinars focuses on one of the components of each dimension, highlighting essential learning that will assist you in your leadership development. The first dimension we're addressing is authenticity. Authentic leaders are recognized by their integrity, and so they inspire trust. They know and live their values. They challenge and empower others to be the best that they can. The dimension of authenticity separates the practice of authentic leadership into 8 components, offering different pathways for your self-development and improved conversations across your organization. There we are. Authenticity breaks down into 8 components. One of these, a key one of these, is ethics, and that's what we're going to address today. I think the first thing perhaps to focus on in relation to ethics is the growing focus that we see in the business world on ethics and ethical behavior. If you think about the criticisms that banks faced around the financial crisis, the criticism that they took public support but then continued to pay staff bonuses, this was widely seen as unethical behavior. Or more recently, again in banking industry, you can see the criticism that banks have come under for the amount of money they lend to vulnerable clients. The criticism there is that they're not lending responsibly or not acting ethically in deciding who to lend to and how much they're going to lend to any individual. There's no doubt that ethics is a key area that leaders need to address. Authentic leaders recognize what underpins ethical decision making. The key point here, I think, is that authentic leaders recognize what underpins their decision making. This is not to say that ethics provide a clear or simple answer to decision making. Rather, it's saying that leaders must understand on what basis and what ethical basis their decisions are being made. What factors must leaders consider when they make decisions? Naturally, the relative weight of factors, and indeed the factors themselves, will vary over time. But ethical leaders always look for the underpinning ethical basis. So, for example, if you think of environmental or green issues, they've been around for quite a long time. And there's been a lot of requirement to think about those issues, but you can see how they've become more prominent in recent years, and you can see how they've become wider and deeper in terms of the consideration that we need to think about in the business world when we think of environmental issues. So now we don't just look at waste, although we do look at waste, we also look at the whole end-to-end process. What's our impact on the environment overall? So there's a good example where there's been an ethical issue, but it's growing and it's widening and it's deepening. And we need to think about how that underpins our decision making. So ethics are rules of behavior based on ideas about what is morally good and morally bad. Acting ethically means acting in ways which are morally good. Acting in a morally bad way may bring you and your organization some short-term success, but it will undermine your longer-term success. This slide is a good overview of what we mean by ethical decision-making and ethical leadership, but it's worth breaking it down into or picking out a couple of points to focus on. The first one I'd focus on is that in the first line that ethics are rules of behavior. Of course, these could be formal rules or formal laws, but they can also be informal. So ethics and ethical consideration often involves looking at standards and norms of behavior which may not even be written down. It's not just about looking at formal documents, it's also looking at wider considerations. Also, I think there's a key thing here on this slide is around balancing. This slide puts it in a bit of a black and white. It's morally right or it's morally wrong. But of course, in practice, authentic leaders need to recognize the limits, not just what's totally unacceptable, but also grapple with the gray areas. So debating, discussing, and being able to explain and recognize the underpinning ethical basis of your decision making is important. It's very rarely a sort of, this is morally right, this is morally bad. It's usually somewhere in the middle and balancing interests. Finally, I'll pick up the point at the bottom there about the short-term success. It's undoubtedly true that acting unethically could bring some financial gain to some organizations. But in the longer term, it creates a huge range of reputational and other issues. Again, perhaps looking at the banking industry. So I just picked one example, very prominent. BNP Paribas was fined $9 billion in 2014 for breaking US laws. And these weren't just sort of technical things. A lot of this was around accusations that they funded the Sudanese government at a time when it was being accused of genocide. The reputational risk there was huge. There may have been a short-term gain, but in the longer term, there was a huge cost. And it's not just the sort of formal fines that firms might be subject to. The management time and the ongoing cost of dealing with these sorts of things are huge. So there may be a short-term gain, but in the long term, ethical behavior will be better for business. Now, as we said, business ethics have been around for some time. It's not something that's new, but perhaps in the last 2 decades, we can see some refocusing on particular issues. So we can look at corporate governance, we can look at corporate social responsibility, sustainability, that's been growing, taking care of other people's money responsibly, proper treatment of employees, contractors, proper treatment of customers, fair treatment of suppliers. Now, if we look at that list, what we can see is that some of these are embedded in formal documents or formal rules. So there's lots around in the UK around corporate governance requirements and so on. Some of them are perhaps less formal, but still written down in many ways. So if you think of corporate social responsibility, for example, there's been a lot of work done to rank organizations around their corporate social responsibility, and a lot of work done to look at how much information firms publish around corporate social responsibility or what they're doing in that space. And firms have responded to this, and if you look at large organizations, they will usually include a section in their annual report on corporate social responsibility. So that's become actually quite a formal way where firms are looking at what improves their ratings and they're responding to that and accordingly. The other thing I'd point out from there is that some of these requirements will be imposed externally. So if you think about the regulation in the financial industry, as we said, in terms of taking care of other people's money responsibly, there's a lot of regulatory work there around how firms are lending and their sustainability of their lending and so on. Or, for example, the supermarket codes of conduct around fair treatment of suppliers. These have become more formal after there became a lot of focus on this area around how supermarkets were treating their suppliers. So some of these issues around ethics have are more formal or are becoming more formal, but some of them are still quite informal and they're still growing in importance. So the proper treatment of customers and staff is an area which is being increasingly highlighted. I think the challenge for leaders in this space is what exactly does this mean in various situations, in different industries and different sectors. The key for an ethical leader here is to be able to show the basis of their decision making. Have you considered all stakeholders? Have you considered the impact on these various stakeholders? Are you able to justify and explain your decisions on these different stakeholders? And I think the range of stakeholders there, as is clear from on the slide, is huge. It's not just people within the organization. It's not just people, customers that are directly interacting with the organization. It might be right along the supply chain, and it might be much more widely in terms of, for example, environmental issues. So this is, in terms of business ethics, is thinking about all sorts of relationships. It's no longer just a formal contract that are important. And I think the key, there's one good example there on the slide about proper treatment of employees and or contractors. We see a change in the way that people are employed or work for different organizations, not just in a formal setting. They may work on a contract basis, or they may work through a third party, but there's a lot of focus on how firms are still treating those contractors that are working with them. So while business ethics has been around for a long time, we can see there are areas that are growing that we need to focus on and that we need to be able, as ethical leaders, to respond to. So if we look at some moral principles around making ethical decisions: honesty, fairness, equality, dignity, diversity, individual rights. Now, these may look like quite high level or grand terms, but for leaders, we need to put them into practice on a day-to-day basis. So it's being able to show that you've acted honestly, fairly, treated people in the right way. It's being able to show that you've considered these sorts of issues. It's been able to apply these principles across a range of different stakeholders and the wider environment. And I think that's a real challenge, yeah, that when we're thinking about how to apply these moral principles, we need to think about the whole range of stakeholders that we have to consider. So they may be employees, they may be customers, they may be host communities. A lot of focus on how is a industry supporting the local area in which it's based. Thinking about those sorts of things are really important, and the environmental issues that we've already mentioned. So ethical, these key moral principles need to be applied in a whole range of settings. I think the argument that ethical behavior is good for business is clear, and it's increasingly recognized. Ethical leaders not only act in a way, they act personally in an ethical way, they also bring this out and encourage others to act in this way. They encourage it and they instigate it. Good ethical behavior is something they encourage throughout the organization. So ethical leaders encourage and instigate decentralization, consultation, creating a better sense of community, creating transparency and accountability across the organization, really enabling people to feel free to express their ideas and get involved in the decision making. And they have systems that reward this and reward continuous change and innovation. The key here, I think, is openness and inclusion. Transparency in decision making and involving staff, encouraging staff to speak up, encouraging staff to become involved. This means that you go beyond the formal opportunities, you go beyond sort of formal consultation meetings or whatever, and you really try and embed this ethical consideration across the culture of the organization. And leaders aren't just doing this themselves, they're encouraging other people to get involved and to think about how the decisions are made in the organization. So leaders are key here. How they treat colleagues and how they reward and celebrate input and debate will set the tone for the organization and will help to encourage this ethical decision making right across the organization. As we know, plenty of organizations that have been caught up in ethical issues have had formal speaking up or whistleblowing procedures. But this hasn't. But part of the reason they've been caught up in the ethical issues is that these formal procedures haven't really filtered through to changing the culture of the organization, either because staff did not value the formal procedure, or because whistleblowers and people who spoke up were ignored or sidelined or worse. So I think the key thing for the ethical leader is not just to make sure we have a formal document, but to make sure that we can embed this openness, transparency, decision making across the organization. And that leads me nicely to the sort of codes of ethics or conduct that many firms have. They define what is acceptable in terms of behavior. They promote high standards of behavior, and they can supply a benchmark against which employees can compare themselves, judge themselves. It can also be a good way of establishing an individual corporate identity. The key here, however, is not just to have a code of ethics or a formal document, it's to go beyond that, not just having a list of do's and don'ts that people blindly follow, but to encourage that debate, encourage that discussion, encourage people to really individually go for the highest standards of behavior. One of the problems that we've seen with these codes of ethics could be that people think, well, if it's not written down in this code of ethics, then it must be acceptable. And I think proper codes of ethics, ones that really have an impact across the organization, do more than that. They challenge their staff to think about this. They give them a basis or a tool to challenge their own behavior and challenge other people's behavior. And they encourage people to debate and discuss. There's been a lot of work around training on codes of ethics. And one of the tricky areas here is that these should be grey areas. It's getting people to debate and discuss the grey areas. But to really embed ethical decision-making in organizations, you do need people to debate this, to think about what their underlying basis is for their decisions. So behaving morally concerns how you make decisions, what you actually decide, how fair, kind, and trustworthy you are. It's a real challenge to leaders, I think, this slide. It's saying to us, we need to think about the ethical underpinning of all the decisions that we make, and also the ethical underpinning of the decisions of the decision-making process in our organizations. We need to put these sort of very high-level challenge, and we need to operationalize that on a day-to-day basis. How do we embed this in our own decision-making, and how do we embed it in the decision-making of our organization? So, to sum up, I think there's something here, a few questions that we can ask ourselves when we're thinking about decisions. And this is something I think a lot of firms would have benefited from when they took those sorts of decisions, when they took decisions to think about, would I be proud of my behavior? Am I respecting the rights of others? How would I feel if people knew what I've done? In what circumstances is my behavior fair and equitable? What you often see when for example, in the banking industry, when scandals are revealed, is that some people in the organization did speak up. They did think, well, this doesn't look quite right, but their leaders didn't support them, or their leaders didn't act on those staff when they spoke up. But I think individually, we all have to focus on these sorts of questions, ask ourselves these sorts of questions. If the decision that I made today, if that became much more widely known, if it was on the front of a newspaper, would I be proud of that? Would I be happy justifying that and explaining that decision? If you ask yourself those sorts of questions, it'll help you to think about ethical decisions, help you to think about the underpinning rationale for your decision making. Finally, just a quick word around culture. And obviously we said that what we're trying to do in improving and embedding ethical decision making is improve the culture and the working of the organization. There are different ways of looking at culture, but I think the key thing around the issue of ethics is that ethics drive the culture. The way that individual leaders operate and the way that they encourage their staff to operate will really drive the culture of the organization. Encouraging them to speak up, encouraging them not just to think about formal rules, but to actually take action and think about those underlying questions that we've just addressed. So I hope you found that useful. Take you through thinking about ethical decisions and ethical decision making. Kate, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We have, going back to your penultimate slide, where the questions to ask yourself. What do you do about those people who really don't want to behave ethically? They are more concerned with short-term goals and actually think that that's more important. It's getting the deal is more important than the ethical underpinning. So they would almost proudly answer in the negative to these questions.
Yeah, I think that is a challenge. I think that, that challenge varies from sector to sector. But I think as a leader, what you have to do is, well, I think there's two things. The first thing is you would try and encourage that staff member to change their way of thinking. Yeah, you would engage with them and you would try and get them to think about their underpinning here, get them to think about how they would justify it. There's no doubt that if you find someone who is just acting unethically, you may need to sort of ease them out of the organization. But I think the first step is to engage with them, get them thinking about these issues. And it's not an overnight thing. I think what we found if you look, for example, in the banking industry, there's been at least 10 years since the financial crash, and people are still engaging with these sorts of issues. They're still engaging with the balance between, short-term decisions, long-term decisions. How do we engage wider stakeholders? All of these sorts of things. So it's an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing piece of work. But you do need to engage directly with that member of staff. I think that's key.
One more observation, really. I'd be interested in your thoughts. I was talking to somebody who'd been in the banking industry for a number of years about this webinar, and his insight was that Friday afternoon, you've got a deal that if you'll meet your targets for the quarter, not enough time to do proper due diligence, but you're letting your team down if they don't meet their target. Can you just understand that maybe they'll take the ethical shortcut there?
You can. And I think back to the point we made about leaders need to set parameters and reward good behavior. And that's quite hard when it's all numbers driven, targets driven. It's not just meeting the getting the deal done. It's the type of deal that you're doing. It's much harder to capture that sort of more abstract benefit. So you can understand why people would make that call. What you have to, I think, get across to them is the risks that they're running in taking that ethical shortcut, as you put it, because it could create huge financial losses in the future for the firm, and we've seen that in many cases. But also, I think you need to make sure that the member of staff is supported in that they've got, they don't feel under undue pressure to hit their targets and then they just do it and then they worry about it later. You support them in coming back saying, we're not going to do this because of these X, Y, and Z reasons. And I think a lot of the problems we faced in the banking industry is exactly as you say. People were driven by short-term targets. They didn't have to think about anything long-term, and it's bringing that in, which is really important.
So that really brings us back to your last point, that it's not a quick fix, it's a long-term investment in role modelling and developing the sorts of behaviours and conduct that we want. Exactly.
I think that this is the thing. We can't give you a set of questions to ask yourself and then it's all done. We want to prompt you to start thinking about these things and start that ongoing debate and discussion in your organisations.
Thank you very much. I think we're out of time now.
Thank you, Kate.